The Church is Not a Family Estate: Law, Stewardship, and Succession, written by Professor Mannix E. Paul, Ph.D., LL.D., Hans. Me Foundation Monthly Lecture, Series 70, June 28, 2026. Across Africa and many developing nations, churches have evolved beyond places of worship into major institutions that own significant assets, including schools, universities, hospitals, publishing houses, television stations, commercial enterprises, residential estates, vehicles, and even private aircraft. These institutions are often built over decades through the faithful giving of millions of worshipers who contribute tithes, offerings, donations, fundraising campaigns, and voluntary labor. While this growth reflects the remarkable expansion of Christianity, it has also exposed one of the most contentious issues facing the modern church. Who owns church property after the death of the founder? This question has become increasingly relevant in recent years as several prominent church founders have died, leaving behind ministries worth millions or even billions of dollars. Instead of celebrating the founder's legacy, many churches have become engulfed in succession disputes, inheritance battles, prolonged litigation, leadership crises, and painful divisions among family members, church boards, and congregations. In some cases, ministries that took decades to build have fragmented within months because there was no clear distinction between the founder's personal estate and the assets belonging to the church. The problem is not merely legal, it is also ethical, spiritual, and institutional. At the center of many of these disputes is the misconception that because a founder established the ministry, every asset connected to that ministry automatically belongs to the founder and should therefore pass to the family upon death. While this assumption may appear reasonable from an emotional standpoint, it is often inconsistent with both nonprofit law and the biblical principles of stewardship. From a legal perspective, churches in many jurisdictions are recognized as nonprofit or charitable organizations rather than privately owned businesses. Although the legal framework varies from country to country, the underlying principle remains remarkably consistent. Property legally owned by a church belongs to the religious institution, not to its founder personally. Such assets are held in trust for religious and charitable purposes and are intended to serve the mission of the church rather than the personal interests of any individual or family. For this reason, church property that is properly registered in the name of the church or its trustees is generally not treated as part of a founder's personal estate. It is therefore not ordinarily subject to inheritance under succession laws. In many jurisdictions, nonprofit organizations are accountable to state regulatory authorities, including attorneys general, charity commissions, corporate affairs regulators, or the courts, all of which have responsibilities to ensure that charitable assets continue serving the purposes for which they were established. Unfortunately, the practical reality is often very different. In many countries, especially where regulatory oversight is weak, church founders frequently register ministry properties in their own names or in the names of spouses, children, or close relatives. Sometimes this is done for convenience during the early years of ministry. In other cases, it reflects inadequate legal advice or poor governance structures. In more troubling situations, church assets are deliberately treated as personal wealth. Once this happens, the line between ministry and private ownership becomes dangerously blurred. After the founder's death, family members may understandably claim legal ownership of those properties because official records identify them as personal assets. Church members, however, often argue that those same properties were purchased using congregational donations intended for God's work rather than for private inheritance. The result is predictable: lawsuits, accusations, church splits, financial paralysis, declining membership, and lasting damage to the ministry's reputation. The increasing number of succession disputes involving churches across Africa demonstrates that these conflicts are no longer isolated incidents. They represent a growing governance crisis that threatens the sustainability of many religious institutions. Ironically, organizations established to preach unity and reconciliation sometimes become examples of division because foundational governance issues were ignored while the founder was alive. Beyond legality lies an even greater question of morality. The church is fundamentally different from a privately owned family business. A business exists primarily to generate profit for its owners and shareholders. A church exists to fulfill a spiritual mission, proclaim the gospel, serve communities, care for the vulnerable, educate society, and advance the kingdom of God. Consequently, those who lead churches are not absolute owners, but stewards entrusted with resources that ultimately belong to God. The Bible repeatedly emphasizes stewardship over ownership. It is required in stewards that one be found faithful, 1 Corinthians 4:2. Likewise, Jesus taught in Luke 12:48 that those entrusted with much bear greater responsibility. These principles remind church leaders that they are custodians of God's resources, accountable not only to congregations, but ultimately to God Himself. Church members give sacrificially because they believe they are investing in God's work. They rarely imagine that their offerings may eventually become part of a family's inheritance. Morally, therefore, converting church assets into personal wealth contradicts the trust upon which charitable giving is based. It risks eroding public confidence, discouraging future generosity, and undermining the credibility of Christian witness. None of this suggests that founders or their families should be neglected. Many founders dedicate their entire lives to building ministries, often sacrificing careers, income, comfort, and personal security. Their spouses and children frequently share those sacrifices. There is nothing inherently wrong with ensuring that founders receive reasonable compensation during their lifetime, or that their families are provided for after their death through legitimate salaries, pensions, insurance, or personal property acquired independently of the church. However, providing for a family should never require converting church property into inherited family wealth. Personal assets legitimately owned by the founder should pass through inheritance according to applicable law. Church assets acquired for ministry purposes should remain dedicated to the mission for which they were donated. The solution lies in establishing robust governance systems long before succession becomes necessary. Every church, regardless of its size, should adopt a written constitution, register competent and independent trustees, maintain audited financial statements, create comprehensive asset registers, implement transparent procurement and financial controls, and develop clear succession plans approved by governing bodies rather than relying solely on family decisions. Church leaders should intentionally separate personal finances from ministry finances. Titles to church properties should be held in the name of the church or its legally recognized trustees, not in the founder's personal name. Independent boards should exercise oversight, and regular financial reporting should become part of the church's culture of accountability. These are not signs of distrust. They are marks of faithful stewardship and institutional maturity. Ultimately, the true legacy of a church founder should not be measured by how much wealth is transferred to family members, but by how effectively the ministry continues fulfilling its divine mission after the founder is gone. Great leaders build institutions that outlive them. They establish governance systems strong enough to preserve unity, maintain transparency, and protect the mission from personal interests. The church belongs to Christ, not to any individual, family, or dynasty. Founders are called, families are honored, but ministries exist to serve God and humanity across generations. When personal ownership is clearly separated from church ownership, succession becomes orderly, inheritance disputes are minimized, public trust is strengthened, and the gospel remains the central focus rather than courtroom battles. In an era where inheritance conflicts and leadership succession disputes are increasingly affecting religious institutions, the church must embrace higher standards of governance. Transparency, accountability, legal compliance, and biblical stewardship are no longer optional. They are essential safeguards for preserving the integrity, credibility, and future of Christ's church. The greatest inheritance a founder can leave is not ownership of church property to a family, but a well-governed institution that continues to transform lives for generations to come. Courtesy of Me Foundation, committed to human capacity building worldwide. Just a voice of reasoning in a complex dispensation. Thank you for listening, and kindly share to inspire others.